Last week, Jeff Bezos made quite a large intervention into the running of his newspaper, The Washington Post. He announced to his team and then tweeted on Twitter or posted on X, depending on whether you've decided to adopt the new corporate vocabulary or not, about how he had decided to change the political outlook of his newspaper. He says in this tweet, "I shared this note with the Washington Post team this morning. I'm writing to let you know about a change coming to our opinion pages. We are going to be writing every day in support and defense of two pillars: personal liberties and free markets. We'll cover other topics too, of course, but viewpoints opposing those pillars will be left to be published by others. There was a time when a newspaper, especially one that was a local monopoly, might have seen it as a service to bring to the reader's doorstep every morning a broad-based opinion section that sought to cover all views. Today, the internet does that job. I am of America and for America, and proud to be so. Our country did not get here by being typical. And a big part of America's success has been freedom in the economic realm and everywhere else. Freedom is ethical, it minimizes coercion, and practical. It drives creativity, invention, and prosperity." I offered David Shipley, whom I greatly admire, the opportunity to lead this new chapter. David Shipley, for context, was the previous opinion editor of the Washington Post. I suggested to him that if the answer wasn't hell yes, then it had to be no. After careful consideration, David decided to step away. This is a significant shift, it won't be easy, and it will require 100% commitment. I respect his decision. We'll be searching for a new opinion editor to own this new direction. I'm confident that free markets and personal liberties are right for America. I also believe these viewpoints are underserved in the current market of ideas and news opinion. I'm excited for us together to fill that void. Jeff. Well, you know, I'm quite happy to use Jeff Bezos' platform here on Twitch to provide an opposing point of view, maybe. So this hasn't come from nowhere, of course. Some of you will remember that prior to the US general election in November, the decision was made by Jeff Bezos personally not to endorse either candidate. His suggestion there was that this was a way of avoiding being viewed as partisan in some way, right? He felt that if the newspaper said we endorse a particular candidate, that why would people who didn't like that candidate trust the Washington Post reporting in the future? Which, you know, is in and of itself a logical argument, right? There is a logic to that. There is one could have a principle that followed along with that. However, the Washington Post had endorsed a candidate for many elections previously. Jeff Bezos tried to frame it as a kind of return to, I think they said something about the return to a kind of previous state. However, it was clearly a change of direction. And in many regards, this decision would clearly seem to play against that. But I think it's also a really important marker, not just in the Washington Post and how that works. I'm not someone who has ever really engaged massively with the Washington Post's reporting or opinion pages. It is a newspaper that both decided to adopt the phrase "democracy dies in darkness" as its slogan, whilst also having quite a stringent paywall, which means you can't read any of its articles unless you are subscribed. It's really a marker of an era in which even quote-unquote legacy media feels like the best positioning for it is to not only be partisan in its reporting and in its opinion pages, but to be openly partisan about that. And one sort of bit of context to add to this is that clearly some of this is about, as Adam Bolton writes here for Sky News in the UK, some of this is about bending the knee, quote unquote, to Donald Trump. Right, we had the Tech Bro inauguration, right, where Mark Zuckerberg, Jeff Bezos, Sundar Pichai, sorry, I don't know why, from Google, Elon Musk, the TikTok guy, what's the TikTok guy called? Shuzi Chu. Hopefully that's a good stab at that. Were all present at the inauguration. Tim Cook as well down here, and all had pretty good seats at the inauguration as well. Like they were sat in front of some cabinet picks. And one of the ways in which they had managed to get some of that favour was in Elon Musk's case, it was by being very supportive of the Trump campaign throughout. For others, like Jeff Bezos, it was by, deciding not to endorse a candidate. And it was also through making donations to the inaugural fund as well. And since the inauguration, since the presidency has kind of itself has kicked off, we have seen those close bonds between the tech world and the political administration of Donald Trump. In what, I think the phrase techno-fascism does not feel ridiculous. Like, there is this really clear bond between a hard right, nationalistic, protectionistic state and quite a small class of extremely wealthy, monopolistic businessmen, all of whom are very much like singular figureheads of the companies that they work for. So some of this is clearly a signal to Donald Trump that is what is happening here. It's a broad signal of alignment with Trump's administration and his policy program. The key phrases here of personal liberties and free markets, those feel like the kinds of things which are part of Trump's worldview. There being a great irony to the notion of free markets, given he's so keen on tariffs, right? And yet he would feel as though he was someone that supported free markets in some kind of abstract sense, even if he doesn't actually in a real sense. But this kind of like real mask-off approach to running a newspaper in favour of certain politics, right? and not just broadly in favour of certain politics, but like buying a newspaper and then adjusting the politics of that newspaper to suit your personal political worldview, doing that openly in particular, right? Not only the fact of doing it, but doing it openly feels notable, right? Because he's got a back channel to Donald Trump, right? He got this invite somehow. I'm sure if Jeff Bezos gets in touch with Donald Trump, he's probably likely to pick up the phone, or at least get back to him, surely. And yet, he's decided to make this statement, this declaration, openly and publicly. Which is interesting for how we engage with and try to understand the media. I grew up in, and have lived for most of my life in, as have all of you, a world in which understanding the sort of biases and preferences of the media generally involved taking an approach broadly as laid out by Chomsky and Herman in this book, Manufacturing Consent. So Herman and Chomsky have this approach to understanding how news stories not only get selected in the first place, like what gets reported on and what doesn't, but also how they get shaped to understand how that happens, right? So they sort of they describe it as a propaganda model in terms of how the private ownership of the media shapes how the news is reported on. But they don't necessarily argue that how that works all the time is that the owner of a media outlet just tells its writers what to write. Because that evidently doesn't always happen. Noon Mail says, what's the difference between this and what Murdoch's been doing for years, though? It's always been common knowledge. Well, hopefully we can get to some of that. Because I think, we do know what Rupert Murdoch's politics are. And yet he would, at least until recently, he would not profess to, he would not admit to shaping the politics of his newspapers in quite the same way as Jeff Bezos has here. So, one of those filters is ownership. One of them is advertising, right? If a newspaper or a news channel is worried that advertisers will pull out if they say something in a certain way or report on a certain topic, that also affects how things get reported on. Sourcing, so newspapers, journalists, broadcast journalists, whoever, they need to have sources to be able to do their job. And, if someone who reports on a local police station is too critical of the police, will the police get in touch when they've got an interesting story? Will they sit down for an interview again? Possibly not. So in Manufacturing Consent, Herman and Chomsky kind of look at these subtle ways in which stories get shaped, and in which, through those methods, the private ownership of the media ends up shaping the news that is reported on and how that news is reported. And so something like this is a change from that, right? Someone was just saying in the chat a moment ago about Rupert Murdoch. Well, we do know Rupert Murdoch's politics. We know the politics of his various outlets, whether that's The Sun, whether that's Fox News, whatever outlet or publication that is. And yet, most journalists who work for any of those outlets would refuse to acknowledge the idea that Rupert Murdoch tells them what to write. I would imagine if he was interviewed publicly, he would try to, suggest that that was not the case. He lets his journalists do journalism, right? But we have very clearly moved into a space where not only has partisanship in the media become something that is no longer kind of a taboo, but almost that it is something that is celebrated and encouraged and viewed as a positive. If we think of all of the podcast appearances that Donald Trump did in the run-up to the last election, you know,
people still think he did win that.
He was going on Logan Paul's podcast because he knew that Logan Paul was broadly aligned with his politics, and, you know, the result was a very fawning interview. Joe Rogan, very much the same, right? As much as big fans of Joe Rogan will argue that he's a sort of free thinker or whatever, it was broadly expected that he would give Trump a good time on his podcast, and that did seem to happen. But we also see this quite a lot on the left. There have always been some outlets which have kind of been quite open about what their political commitments are. You know, in the UK, think of like the Morning Star or something, which has been around since 1930, apparently, and is pretty open about, you know, in their logo, Morning Star for peace and socialism. And we see more of these in the present day. We see, like, you know, Novara Media quite open about being a left-wing media outlet. We're up against huge power and influence. Our supporters keep us, you know, people-powered media. But you also see it on the political right? If you think of Rebel News or something, which is a Canadian right-wing news channel, you know, actively rails against the idea that what it calls mainstream media is, you know, mainstream media says that it's impartial. We're happy not to be, right? We're going to be conservative. We believe in freedom and judging people on their individual merit, etc. There's a real pride in a lot of these newer media outlets about the idea of being partisan. And, like, there's a lot of truth to that. Sigel saying most labour union a lot of unions have their own in-house publications, and, you know, they're pretty open with the fact that they are pro the union that is publishing them, and they're going to take a side in that. And, like, there is a lot about this that is much more honest than the previous scenario. The biggest news organisation which really at least presents itself as being impartial, at least within my kind of sphere of things I engage with, is the BBC, which, you know, really would say that it tries to really hold itself to this high standard of impartiality, and that is true sometimes. Broadly speaking, it would be fair to say that the BBC tends to be lean in favour of whoever is in government at the time in the UK, partly because the government has control over how it gets its money, basically. It doesn't get paid its money directly from the government. It has a thing called a licence fee, but the government gets to set how much that is. And therefore, as a couple of people are saying in the chat, has tended to, throughout history, lean towards supporting the government in the things that it likes to do. Harry Hassas, unless it's Laura Kunsberg or Question Time. Yeah, Question Time in particular does tend to have quite a right-wing bent to it. At other times, where the BBC has tried to be quote-unquote impartial, it massively falls flat. There was a time where they sort of announced that they were going to no longer have climate deniers on, because for quite a long time, the BBC, as Media Reform Coalition is saying here, had interpreted their view of doing impartiality as going, well, if we have someone on who's going to talk about how the climate crisis is bad, we also have to have someone on who is going to tell us that it's climate change isn't real, etc., etc. At which point, you know, the old adage that if two people are arguing whether it's raining or not, the goal of a journalist isn't to find a happy medium between those 2 points, it's to look outside the window and say whether it is or not, kind of comes in, right? So in many ways, this much rawer kind of embrace of partiality and partisanship in the media is more honest. However, does such an approach encourage you to lead into that partisanship? Whereas, you know, the BBC is not perfectly impartial. None of its individual journalists are perfectly impartial. However, the fact that it has to kind of keep up that pretense, because it wants that to be part of its identity, you would think means that at times, you know, even if I'm a stark raving Tory writing an article for the BBC website, or editing an article for the BBC website, I have to include something else to kind of try and balance that out. I can't totally run with that, because else it destroys the it destroys that mirage of me being perfectly fair and balanced, etc. Whereas if I'm working for the Washington Post, or for, I don't know, Rebel News or whoever it is, or Tenet Media, do I lean into that partisanship? Because probably what will happen is you will garner an audience who are there because they want the political viewpoint to be a certain way. You know? It'll be interesting to see whether other newspapers do a similar thing. You know, there are certainly many other newspapers that are quite open about what their political viewpoints are. However, most would probably just say that they do the best journalism or whatever. You know, The Guardian probably rarely just says we're a kind of centrist liberal newspaper. They'll describe themselves as being independent journalism, right? It's obviously all a bit of a gift to politicians, because, you know, as we saw in Trump's podcast round, where he did Theo Von, where he did Logan Paul and Joe Rogan, etc. But also on the other side of the aisle, you know, Kamala Harris decided to do Call Me Daddy, and a couple of other podcasts. You know, as a politician, you kind of get to pick what outlets you want to speak to, and you can pick ones which are likely to give you an easy ride, right? Whereas if you're in a context where, you know, BBC or whoever else it is, that are kind of at least having to appeal to the idea of being fair and balanced or impartial or whatever words we want to use, politicians of all political stripes have to engage with those organisations. In fact, what we've seen over the weekend is that the White House has kind of taken control of the press pool, is how the BBC have put this here. So, in the US, the way it works has generally been that the White House Correspondents Association, which most of you will be aware of from the dinner they do. So every year they do a dinner where they have a comedian of some description, usually do a kind of bunch of gags. But basically they also organise the internal logistics of who gets to kind of be in the White House briefing room, press briefings, and ask questions, etc. And within that, there are certain traditions. So the Associated Press, so the Associated Press, very few people read the Associated Press website. However, the Associated Press journalists file copy for other organizations which don't necessarily have their own person that goes to the White House, or they do that for other stuff as well. But so the tradition has always been that they get to ask the first question. But as things stand, the Associated Press have been effectively kicked out of the White House because they're refusing to use the Gulf of America rather than Gulf of Mexico verbiage. And various media outlets have lost their desk space within the White House as well. I think the NYT has been told it can't have a desk anymore and stuff. And so there's this real push to kind of decide who gets to report on politics based on who is likely to say positive things. A while back there was also the idea that the White House White House to open media access to podcasters, influencers. There was sort of this idea that they were going to start inviting in influencers as well as journalists, which I'm and obviously I'm an interested party here. I'm not entirely against having new media outlets within, reporting on events at, whether that's party conferences, whether that's in the White House, whether that's in Parliament, or the equivalent institutions wherever you are. Or individual independent people who are doing some kind of news-based, journalism-based work. And I do think, you have to be careful about how you draw those lines about going, oh, that person isn't a journalist because of X, Y, and Z. However, the push here was clearly, oh, we can get in some podcasters or whoever that we quite like, right? We can get, Logan Paul to ask questions at White House briefing. And so it's going to be interesting to see what direction that goes in. And is this kind of thing successful? Because I think to some extent it already has proven successful in the new media space. There are very few new media a lot of new media organizations are very intentionally and openly partisan. And whether or not that's something which older organizations lean into as well. We'll see, I guess. We'll see. Thank you so much for watching this clip from one of my Monday night live shows. If you would like to watch any of these clips ad and sponsor free, then you can do so over on Nebula, where you can also watch my debut feature-length documentary Boomers, my class where I talk about how I turn lots of research into engaging and fun videos, how to research like a PhD student, and also the brand new Nebula original show, Abolish Everything, which is a really fun panel show in which a bunch of comedians from New York tell you about various things from life that they want to see abolished. If you want to get a great deal on signing up for Nebula, then you can do so by heading to go.nebula.tv/Tom Nicholas. I'll see you over on Nebula, or if not, in another clip at some point soon.